Good evening, dear reader, and welcome. Pull your chair a little closer if you will. The fire is warm, the hour is late, and tonight we find ourselves in the most dangerous of all places. Not a dark alley, not a foggy moor, but a dinner table in Mayfair, London, surrounded by polished silver, crystal glasses, and smiling faces that hide the ugliest of secrets. Tonight's story is called The Poisoned Chalice of Mayfair. A diplomat will fall, a golden cup will carry death, and it will fall to one man, the great Hercule Poirot, to find the truth hiding beneath silk gloves and pleasant conversation. If you enjoy a mystery told in the old tradition, patient, clever, and full of human frailty, then stay with us. The first chapter begins now. The dinner at Mayfair. The winter of 1952 had settled over London like a grey wool blanket, heavy, damp, and altogether unwilling to lift. The streets of Mayfair, however, seemed quite indifferent to the cold. Behind the tall Georgian windows of Ashworth House, number 14, Grosvenor Square, candlelight flickered warmly against the glass, and the faint sound of a string quartet drifted out into the frozen evening air. It was, by all accounts, the dinner party of the season. Lady Evelyn Ashworth had a gift for these things. She always had. Even her closest friends, those who had known her since her debutante days, agreed that there was nobody quite like Evelyn when it came to assembling the right people in the right room at precisely the right moment. The flowers were always fresh. The wine was always correct. The conversation was always just dangerous enough to be interesting, but never quite dangerous enough to cause a scene. At least that had been true until tonight. The dining room of Ashworth House was a long rectangular affair with high ceilings and walls panelled in dark oak. 2 rows of candelabras ran the length of the mahogany table, casting a warm amber light across the faces of the 12 guests who had been invited to dine. The table itself was dressed immaculately. White linen, Wedgwood china, and at the very centre, occupying the place of honour, a golden chalice. It was an extraordinary object. Roughly the size of a large wine goblet it had been crafted, so Lord Ashworth liked to tell his guests by a Florentine silversmith in the 16th century. The stem was twisted, the bowl wide and shallow, and around its rim ran a delicate engraving of laurel leaves and figures that might have been angels or might have been something else entirely, depending on one's imagination. It had been in the Ashworth family for 3 generations, acquired, somewhat vaguely, during Lord Ashworth's grandfather's time in Italy. Lord Gerald Ashworth himself sat at the head of the table. He was a broad man, perhaps 60 years of age, with a full head of silver hair brushed back severely from a wide forehead. He had the particular quality of appearing larger than he was, a useful trait, no doubt, in his years as a junior minister in the Foreign Office, a position he had quietly vacated some 4 years prior under circumstances that were never discussed in polite company. He wore his dinner jacket with the ease of a man who had worn one every night of his adult life, and he smiled frequently. That particular smile of the powerful, which conveyed warmth without ever quite reaching the eyes. To his right sat the guest of honour, Sir Douglas Pembridge. Sir Douglas was somewhere in his mid-50s, though he carried it badly. He was thin in an unhealthy way, the kind of thin that suggested not a disciplined appetite but rather a nervous one, and his complexion had the yellowish tinge of a man who had spent too many years in foreign postings with unreliable water. He was, by the account of anyone who followed diplomatic affairs, a rising figure in the Foreign Office. His recent appointment as special envoy to the Near East negotiations had been reported in the Times with considerable enthusiasm. He had, people said, a gift for reading rooms, for understanding what each person in a negotiation truly wanted, beneath all the stated positions and formal pleasantries. He did not, unfortunately, appear to be enjoying his evening. He had arrived late, a minor but noted transgression in Lady Evelyn's household, and had offered an apology so brief it bordered on dismissive. Throughout the soup course he had been distracted, his gaze moving around the table with a quality that one could not quite call suspicion, but which was not entirely comfortable either. Twice he had reached for his wine glass, brought it to his lips, and set it down again without drinking. The other guests arranged themselves around the table in the manner of a carefully composed portrait. Mrs. Cecily Vane occupied the chair directly opposite Sir Douglas, which Lady Evelyn had almost certainly arranged deliberately, though her reasons for doing so were not immediately apparent. Cecily was a widow of perhaps 45, though she might easily have passed for younger. She had that quality of stillness that some women cultivate over years of social difficulty, a composed, watchful patience that could be mistaken for serenity by those who did not look closely enough. She was dressed in black, as she invariably was, and wore at her throat a single strand of pearls. She smiled pleasantly whenever she was spoken to, and when she was not spoken to, she watched. Beside her sat Captain Rupert Fallow, late of the Coldstream Guards, now apparently of no particular occupation, who laughed too loudly at his own observations and had already, by the fish course, consumed considerably more wine than was advisable. He was one of those handsome men who had passed through the world on the strength of his chin and his regiment, and had not yet fully registered that neither carried the same currency it once had. Further along sat Mr. and Mrs. Hargreave, a solicitor from Lincoln's Inn and his perfectly pleasant wife, whose name everyone always forgot, and beyond them a young attaché from the French embassy named Beaumont, who spoke English with precision and watched everything with the quiet, professional attentiveness of a man trained to report back. At the far end of the table, somewhat apart from the general conversation, sat a woman introduced only as Miss Drummond, a connection of Lady Evelyn's from Edinburgh, apparently, though the precise nature of the connection had not been explained. She was young, perhaps 28, with dark hair and an accent she had clearly worked to soften. She ate steadily and spoke little, but when she did speak, the words were exact. It was during the third course, a roasted pheasant that cook had prepared with some anxiety given the distinction of the company, that Lord Ashworth rose from his chair and lifted the golden chalice. This was, apparently, a ritual. Several of the guests who had dined at Ashworth House before showed the faint recognition of those who know what is coming. Lord Ashworth filled the chalice himself from a particular bottle of Burgundy that had been brought up from the cellar for precisely this purpose, and he spoke the words that he had spoken, it seemed, many times before. In this house, he said, with the measured cadence of a man who enjoys the sound of his own voice rather more than is strictly necessary, we have a tradition. The chalice passes to our guest of honour. It is an old custom, older than the chalice itself, I sometimes think, a gesture of trust, of friendship, of welcome. He extended the chalice towards Sir Douglas with a broad smile. Sir Douglas looked at it for a moment. Just a moment, long enough for Mrs. Cecily Vane, who was watching, to notice the pause. Then he took it, inclined his head in acknowledgement and raised it toward the table. "To our hosts," he said, "and to honourable company." He drank. The conversation resumed. Captain Fallow said something loud about the grouse season. Young Beaumont asked Mrs. Hargreave a question about the theatre. Then Lady Evelyn touched her husband's arm and murmured something that made him laugh softly. It was, all things considered, going rather well. And then Sir Douglas Pembridge set down the golden chalice, pressed his hand flat against the tablecloth as though steadying himself, and said, quite quietly to nobody in particular, "I don't feel at all well." The words were so understated, so entirely in keeping with the English tradition of extreme understatement in moments of crisis, that for a full 3 seconds nobody moved. Then Mrs. Cecily Vane rose from her chair. Then Captain Fallow said, "I say," and then Sir Douglas slid sideways from his seat and crumpled to the floor of the Ashworth dining room, taking with him a full glass of Burgundy, a bread roll, and the untroubled atmosphere of what had been, until that precise moment. The dinner party of the season. The golden chalice remained on the table, still, gleaming, empty. The chalice and the collapse. The first thing that Lady Evelyn Ashworth did, upon seeing her guest of honour collapse onto the dining room floor, was press both hands flat against the table and close her eyes for precisely 2 seconds. It was not grief, exactly, and it was not shock. It was the expression of a woman who has spent 30 years managing difficult situations and recognises, in the pit of her stomach, that this one is going to be considerably worse than most. The second thing she did was turn to her husband. Lord Ashworth was already on his feet. Whatever else one might say about Gerald Ashworth, and there were, in certain circles, quite a number of things one might say, he did not lack composure in a crisis. He was kneeling beside Sir Douglas within moments, one hand on the man's shoulder, his voice low and controlled. "Pembridge, Douglas, can you hear me?" Sir Douglas could, apparently, hear him, but he could not respond in any useful way. He lay on the Persian carpet with his knees drawn slightly upward, one hand clutching at the front of his dinner jacket. His breathing was audible, shallow and rapid, with a faint catching quality that was unpleasant to hear. His face, already pale when he arrived, had taken on a greyish cast that was distinctly alarming. "A doctor," said Miss Drummond from the far end of the table. Her voice was perfectly steady. Someone telephoned for a doctor immediately. It was remarkable, several guests would later reflect, that it had taken a near stranger, the quiet young woman from Edinburgh whom nobody had paid much attention to all evening, to say the obvious thing first. The next 20 minutes were of the particular variety that imprint themselves permanently on the memory of everyone present. A telephone call was made. Dr. Humphrey Marsh, who lived 4 streets away on Mount Street and was, fortunately, still awake, arrived within 12 minutes wearing his overcoat over his pyjamas and carrying his bag with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to being summoned at inconvenient hours. He knelt beside Sir Douglas, made his examination with focused speed, and then looked up at the assembled faces around him with an expression that communicated, without a single word, that this was not a matter of indigestion or overexcitement. "I need everyone to move back, please," he said, "and I need someone to telephone for an ambulance now." Captain Fallow, who had been hovering uselessly near the fireplace with his wine glass still in his hand, apparently having forgotten he was holding it, said, "Good Lord, is it serious?" Dr. Marsh did not answer him. Lady Evelyn went to the telephone herself. While they waited for the ambulance, the room underwent the particular transformation that serious events impose upon social gatherings. The string quartet in the adjoining salon had fallen silent. Someone had evidently thought to inform them that their services were no longer appropriate. The candelabras still burned. The pheasant grew cold on its platter. The guests stood or sat in the scattered, uncertain postures of people who do not know whether to leave or stay, and who are obscurely afraid that either choice might look wrong. Mrs. Cecily Vane had not sat back down. She stood near the window, her arms folded loosely, her gaze moving between Sir Douglas on the floor and the golden chalice on the table. Her expression was composed, perhaps too composed. Captain Fallow had finally set down his wineglass, which was something. Young Beaumont from the French embassy had produced a small notebook from his inside pocket, and then, apparently thinking better of it, put it away again. Mr. Hargreave, the solicitor, approached Lord Ashworth quietly and said something in a low voice. Lord Ashworth shook his head once. Miss Drummond had moved closer to where Sir Douglas lay, and stood watching Dr. Marsh work with an attentiveness that was not morbid, but rather appeared oddly professional. It was she who noticed it first. "The chalice," she said. Everyone looked at her. "It should not be touched," she said. "Not by anyone. Not until—" She paused, and chose her next words with some care. "Not until the proper people have seen it." There was a silence. "My dear girl," said Lord Ashworth, with the particular tone of a man of his generation addressing a young woman who said something inconvenient, "I hardly think there is any need to be dramatic. Douglas has clearly been taken ill. These things happen." "Yes," said Miss Drummond, meeting his gaze without difficulty. "They do." The ambulance arrived at 11 minutes past 10. The 2 attendants moved with practiced speed. Sir Douglas was lifted with care, assessed with brisk professionalism, and carried out through the entrance hall of Ashworth House on a stretcher while Lady Evelyn stood at the foot of the stairs with her hands clasped and watched. Dr. Marsh accompanied them, pausing only at the door to tell Lord Ashworth that he would telephone from the hospital as soon as he knew anything further. "What is it?" Lord Ashworth asked him quietly at the door. "Between us, Humphrey, what do you think it is?" Dr. Marsh looked at him for a moment. Then he said simply, "I don't know yet," and went out. It was not the answer Lord Ashworth had been hoping for. His face, when he turned back to his remaining guests, had changed slightly. Something tighter around the jaw, something more careful in the eyes. Inspector Harold Crail of Scotland Yard arrived at 10:30. He had not been sent for by anyone in the house. He had been sent for by Dr. Marsh, who had telephoned from the hospital with a request that someone from the yard attend Ashworth House that evening, and who had used, in that telephone call, a particular word, a clinical word, a specific word, that had the effect of making the duty sergeant sit up rather sharply and put down his tea. Inspector Crail was a tall man, lean and angular, with a long face, and the permanently slightly dissatisfied expression of someone who has spent too many years being proven right about human nature. He wore a dark overcoat and a hat that he did not remove when he entered the dining room, which Lady Evelyn noted and did not comment upon. He had brought with him a younger constable named Willis, who carried a notebook and looked somewhat overwhelmed by the address. Crail surveyed the dining room with the systematic sweep of a man cataloguing a scene, and then his gaze settled on the golden chalice at the centre of the table. "Nobody has touched that," said Miss Drummond. It was a statement, not a question. Crail looked at her with mild surprise, the surprise of a man not accustomed to having useful information volunteered before he had asked for it. "And you are?" he said. "Margaret Drummond. I am a guest." "Miss Drummond made the observation early on," said Mr. Hargreave from his chair, "about the chalice. She was quite insistent." Crail looked at her a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he turned to Lord Ashworth. "I will need to speak with each of you," he said, "individually, tonight if possible. I appreciate the hour is late." "Inspector," said Lord Ashworth with considerable dignity, "I must tell you that I find this entire approach somewhat premature. Douglas Pembridge is an unwell man. He has been unwell for some time. What happened here this evening was most likely—" "Sir Douglas Pembridge," said Inspector Crail with the flat, quiet authority of a man who delivers difficult facts for a living, "was admitted to St. George's Hospital 40 minutes ago. Dr. Marsh has indicated that his symptoms are consistent with poisoning." He let the words sit in the room for a moment. "The hospital has been in contact with the Yard. That is why I am here." The dining room was very quiet. The candles had burned lower. Somewhere outside, a motor car passed along Grosvenor Square, its headlights briefly brightening the curtains. The golden chalice caught the light, as it had caught it all evening, beautiful, ancient, and now something else entirely. Captain Fallow said in a voice considerably smaller than his usual register, "Good God." Nobody disagreed with him. "Poirot enters." Hercule Poirot had not intended to be in Mayfair that evening. He had intended, in fact, to be in his flat on Whitehaven Mansions in his favourite armchair, with a cup of tisane, a small plate of the particular Belgian biscuits that his housekeeper Mrs. Turner had learned, after considerable trial and error, to purchase from the correct shop on Marylebone High Street. He had intended an evening of complete and deliberate idleness. He had even, earlier that afternoon, declined an invitation to a lecture at the Royal Geographical Society, on the grounds that he had no interest whatsoever in the geographical or any other qualities of the Upper Nile. He was, in short, a man who had arranged his Tuesday evening with great precision and considerable personal satisfaction. It was therefore somewhat irritating that Inspector Harold Crail had chosen this particular Tuesday to telephone him at 11:30 at night. Poirot listened to Crail's account without interrupting, which was unusual for him. He stood at the telephone table in his hallway. He refused, on principle, to conduct serious conversation sitting down, with the receiver held precisely half an inch from his ear, in the manner of a man who respects the instrument but does not entirely trust it. When Crail finished, there was a brief silence. "The chalice," said Poirot. "It has been secured?" "It has," said Crail. "I've had it bagged. Willis is with it now." "And the guests? They remain at the house?" "For the moment. Lady Ashworth has been—" Crail paused, selecting his word with the care of a man navigating social minefields. "Accommodating? But I don't think that will last much longer. Lord Ashworth has already mentioned his solicitor twice." "Twice," repeated Poirot thoughtfully. "In how long a period?" "About 20 minutes. "Ah." Poirot was quiet for a moment. "And Dr. Marsh? What precisely did he say? The exact words, if you please, Crail. The exact words are always important." Crail sighed, in the way of a man who has had this particular instruction from Poirot before, and finds it no less trying for the repetition. He read from his notes. The symptoms as described by Dr. Marsh were specific: the sudden onset, the particular quality of the breathing difficulty, the muscular rigidity, the colouring. Poirot listened with his eyes half closed in the manner of a man not listening to the words so much as the shape they made. "Yes," he said, when Crail had finished. "Yes, I see. I will come." "I was rather hoping you'd say that," said Crail, with the grudging relief of a man who would never quite admit in direct terms that he wanted Poirot's help. "You will have the tisane sent up from the kitchen," said Poirot. "Properly made, Crail. Not that dreadful brown water your constables produce." There was a pause on the line. "This is a crime scene, Poirot. It is also nearly midnight, and I'm doing you a considerable favour. Tisane, if you please." He replaced the receiver, went to inform Mrs. Turner that he would be going out after all, and spent 4 minutes in front of his mirror ensuring that his moustaches were perfectly symmetrical before putting on his coat. He arrived at Ashworth House at 12 minutes past midnight. The square was quiet. A police motor car sat at the curb, its presence lending the elegant Georgian facade an incongruous, slightly apologetic air, as though the house itself were embarrassed by the attention. Poirot stood on the pavement for a moment before entering, as he often did, not from hesitation, but from habit. He liked to see a house before it saw him. Ashworth House was, he observed, a very fine house. It was also, he observed, a house that worked extremely hard at being a very fine house. There was a quality of deliberateness to its presentation: the freshly painted railings, the immaculate window boxes, the brass fittings on the door polished to a brightness that suggested Not just pride of ownership, but something closer to insistence. It was the house of a man who wished to be seen, to belong exactly where he was. Poirot found that interesting. He went up the steps and rang the bell. Inspector Crail met him in the entrance hall with the expression of a man who is glad to see someone but considers it important not to show it. He was in his shirt sleeves, his overcoat had been draped over the banister, and he looked tired in the particular way of men who have been managing a complicated situation for several hours and are beginning to feel the weight of it. "Poirot," he said. "Mon ami," said Poirot, removing his coat and hat and handing them to the young constable Willis, who accepted them with the slightly startled expression of someone who had not expected this function to fall to him. "Tell me what you have." They walked through to a small sitting room off the entrance hall. The drawing room, Poirot noted, not the dining room, which was still sealed, and someone had lit the fire, which had burned down to a comfortable glow. On a small table near the window, a cup of something was waiting. Poirot examined it, lifted it, and took a sip. He set it down again with an expression of dignified disappointment. It was tea. "I did pass on your message," said Crail, without particular sympathy. Poirot accepted this with the quiet suffering of a man accustomed to having his reasonable requests ignored by the English, and turned his attention to the matter at hand. Crail laid out what he had. 12 guests at dinner. The tradition of the chalice, which Crail described with the slight discomfort of a practical man obliged to discuss theatrical customs. The chalice filled by Lord Ashworth personally, from a specific bottle of Burgundy. Sir Douglas drinking from it, and no one else. The collapse. Some 10 to 12 minutes later, during the third course. 10 to 12 minutes, said Poirot. You're certain of this timing? Near enough. 2 of the guests confirmed it independently. Which guests? Miss Drummond and Mr. Hargreave. Poirot's small, dark eyes moved slightly. Miss Drummond, he repeated. Tell me about this Miss Drummond. Crail consulted his notes. Margaret Drummond, 29 years of age, introduced as a connection of Lady Ashworth's from Edinburgh. Lady Ashworth describes her as the daughter of an old school friend. He paused. She was the one who told everyone not to touch the chalice before I arrived, apparently quite firmly. Poirot pressed the tips of his fingers together in the way he had when something interested him. And the others? They complied? They did. Though Lord Ashworth apparently made some comment about her being dramatic. Of course he did, said Poirot mildly. He was quiet for a moment. And the wine, the particular bottle from which the chalice was filled. Where is it? Crail looked at him. Then he looked at Willis. Willis looked at his notebook. There was a pause of the kind that is not at all comfortable. The bottle, said Poirot again, with patience that was beginning to develop visible edges. It was on the table, said Crail slowly. When I arrived, it was on the table. Willis. He turned to the constable with an expression that did not bode well for the young man's immediate future. The bottle. Where is it now? Willis turned several pages of his notebook with the desperate energy of a man hoping that the answer might somehow materialize within them. It did not. I believe, said Willis in a very small voice, that one of the kitchen staff may have, that is, in the course of clearing. The bottle, said Poirot with great quietness, has been cleared away. It would appear so, sir, said Willis. There was a silence. Poirot looked at the dying fire. He said nothing for a moment. Crail, to his credit, did not attempt to minimize what had happened. It was a significant error, the kind that could not be undone and would need to be worked around. Very well, said Poirot at last. He did not say it was fine because it was not fine, but he said it in the tone of a man who has accepted an obstacle and is already thinking about how to proceed regardless. We must hope that the chalice itself is sufficient, and we must speak to the kitchen staff tonight, before anything else is disturbed. He rose from his chair. Now, I will see the dining room. The dining room had been preserved more or less as Crail had found it. The table still bore the remains of the interrupted dinner, the plates, the glassware, the cold pheasant, though the chalice itself had been removed and bagged. Poirot walked the length of the room slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes moving across everything with the steady, methodical attention of a man reading a document he does not yet fully understand. He stopped at Lord Ashworth's chair. He looked at the position of the chalice, or rather, at the ring it had left on the white linen, a faint reddish circle directly before the head of the table. He looked at the distance between that position and Sir Douglas's place to the right. He stood very still for a moment. Then he moved to Sir Douglas's chair and stood there instead. He looked back toward Lord Ashworth's position. He looked at the table arrangement, the placement of the glasses, the angle of the candelabras. He looked at the empty space where the wine bottle had been, and something shifted very slightly behind his eyes. Not a conclusion, not yet, but the faintest suggestion of a shape beginning to form, the way a figure emerges slowly from a fog, one feature at a time. "The guests," he said. "I will see them now, one at a time." He turned to Crail. "Beginning, I think, with Mrs. Cecily Vane." Crail raised an eyebrow. "Any particular reason?" Poirot considered this for a moment, which was itself slightly unusual. He was not ordinarily a man who needed to consider before answering. She was watching," he said finally. "All evening, according to your notes, she was watching. I'm curious, Crail, what it was that she saw." He straightened his cuffs, squared his small shoulders, and walked toward the door. "And Crail," he added without turning around, "please, no more tea. The little grey cells begin." Mrs. Cecily Vane was waiting in the small library at the end of the first-floor corridor. Someone, Lady Evelyn most likely, had thought to light the lamps in there, and the room had the particular quality of a place that is used infrequently but maintained with care. The shelves were full but not disordered. A small writing desk stood near the window. 2 armchairs faced each other across a low table, on which someone had placed at some point during the evening a glass of water that had not been touched. Mrs. Vane was sitting in the chair nearest the fireplace, not because there was a fire, but because it was the chair that faced the door. Poirot noticed this immediately. She had positioned herself so that she would see whoever entered before they saw her clearly, and it was the choice of a woman accustomed to observing from positions of advantage. She was composed, entirely, almost unnaturally composed, the kind of stillness that is not natural ease but rather something constructed, over time, out of necessity. Her hands were folded in her lap, her back was straight. Her dark eyes moved to Poirot as he entered with an alertness that she did not bother to conceal. Poirot settled into the opposite chair, adjusted his position once. He disliked chairs that did not support the back correctly, and regarded her with the mild, pleasant expression that those who knew him well had learned to be somewhat cautious of. "Madame Vane," he said, "I am Hercule Poirot. I hope you will forgive the lateness of the hour." "I was not asleep," she said. Her voice was even, the accent of a woman educated carefully. I don't imagine any of us will sleep particularly well tonight." "No," agreed Poirot. "I think that is probably true." He paused. "You knew Sir Douglas Pembridge?" It was not a question. She recognised it as such. "Yes," she said. "We were acquainted." "For how long?" A small pause, brief enough to be almost unnoticeable, long enough for Poirot to notice it. "Several years. We moved in some of the same circles. Diplomatic functions occasionally, that sort of thing." "And your relationship with him was cordial," she said, precisely and immediately as though the word had been prepared in advance. Poirot looked at her pleasantly. "Only cordial?" Mrs. Vane met his gaze without difficulty. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot, only cordial." He did not press the point, not yet. Instead, he asked her to describe the evening as she had observed it, from the beginning, from her arrival, in whatever detail she could recall. This was a technique he employed often and valued greatly. People, in the act of narrating, revealed considerably more than they intended. The emphasis they placed, the details they chose, the moments they skipped over quickly, all of it spoke, if one knew how to listen. Mrs. Vane was a careful narrator. She described the arrival of guests, the pre-dinner drinks in the drawing room, the movement to the dining table, all with accuracy and without elaboration. She described the seating arrangement. She described the courses. When she reached the moment of the chalice, she slowed almost imperceptibly. "Lord Ashworth filled it himself," she said, "from the Burgundy. He made his small speech. He always does, apparently, with that chalice, and then he handed it to Sir Douglas." "You have attended dinners here before?" said Poirot. "Once, about 2 years ago. The chalice ritual is the same." "And on that occasion, who was the guest of honour?" she thought for a moment. "A gentleman from the Board of Trade. I don't recall the name." "He drank from the chalice?" "He did. And suffered no ill effects?" "None whatsoever." She looked at Poirot steadily. "Which is what makes tonight rather particular, isn't it?" "Quite so," said Poirot. "Quite so." He was quiet for a moment, appearing to examine his own fingertips with mild interest. Then he said without looking up, "When Sir Douglas took the chalice, madam, before he drank, did you notice anything? Anything at all? However small it may have seemed?" She was still for a moment. "He hesitated," she said, Poirot looked up, just for a moment. A second, perhaps less. Most people would not have seen it. She paused, but he hesitated before he drank, as though he was reluctant. As though he was deciding, she said, choosing the word carefully. There is a difference. Poirot regarded her with an expression that was, for just a moment, something warmer than professional interest. Madame, he said, you're a very observant woman. She did not smile. It has been necessary, she said simply. He spoke to Captain Fallow next, which was considerably less productive. Fallow had recovered some of his volume by the time Poirot sat down with him in the drawing room. Though his colour suggested that his confidence was largely reconstructed rather than genuine, he was the kind of man, Poirot reflected, who filled silences with noise because silences frightened him, who talked about what he had done and where he had been and who he had known because the alternative was to sit quietly with himself, which he found apparently unbearable. He had noticed nothing useful during the dinner. He said so at some length. He had been seated 3 places from Sir Douglas, and had been engaged, for most of the relevant period, in a conversation with Mrs. Hargreave about a mutual acquaintance in Hampshire. He had seen Sir Douglas drink from the chalice. Everyone had seen that, but had observed nothing out of the ordinary. Sir Douglas had seemed quiet, but then Sir Douglas was often quiet. Not what you'd call a lively dinner companion, frankly, between you and me. You knew Sir Douglas well? Poirot asked. Oh, years and years. We were at school together briefly, then lost touch, bumped into each other occasionally. Foreign Office circles, you know how it is. And was there anything between you, any matter of business, perhaps, or personal disagreement? Fallow looked at him with the expression of a man who considers the question slightly offensive. Good Lord, no. Douglas and I were perfectly cuts. Look here, Poirot, I hope you're not suggesting. I suggest nothing, said Poirot pleasantly. I ask only. It is my method, Captain. I ask everyone everything. It is much less personal than it sounds. Fallow subsided, though not without some residual huffiness. Poirot thanked him and moved on. Lord Ashworth received him in his study. A deliberate choice of room, Poirot suspected, and a deliberate choice of positioning. Ashworth was behind his desk when Poirot entered, which placed him at an elevation and behind a barrier of mahogany and family photographs. It was the unconscious arrangement of a man who felt more comfortable conducting conversations from a position of defined authority. Poirot sat in the chair provided, a somewhat lower and less comfortable chair than the one behind the desk, he noticed, and folded his hands. This is an extraordinary business, said Lord Ashworth before Poirot could speak. Extraordinary and deeply unfortunate. I want to make clear, Monsieur Poirot, that this household has nothing whatsoever, to hide. We are as distressed by tonight's events as anyone. Of course, said Poirot. Douglas Pembridge is a man I have known for 20 years. The suggestion that something deliberate has occurred here, in my home, at my table. He shook his head with an expression of controlled indignation. The suggestion, said Poirot mildly, has not been made by me, my lord. It has been made, in effect, by Sir Douglas's own symptoms. He paused. Tell me about the wine. The particular bottle used for the chalice. It was from your cellar? It was, a 1943 Burgundy. I select it personally for special occasions. And before dinner, where was it? Who had access to it? Ashworth frowned slightly. It was brought up from the cellar this afternoon. It would have been in the kitchen or the dining room sideboard. He stopped. Something moved across his face. A flicker of calculation quickly suppressed. The staff would have had access, my wife, myself. I cannot say who else might have passed through. The dining room, was it left unattended at any point before dinner? Possibly, briefly. These things are difficult to account for precisely. Yes, said Poirot softly. They are. He asked several more questions, about the guest list, about Sir Douglas's recent activities, about whether anything unusual had occurred in the weeks prior to the dinner. Ashworth answered each one with the smooth fluency of a man practiced at managing information, giving enough to appear cooperative, Poirot felt, while remaining very careful about what he actually disclosed. When Poirot rose to leave, Ashworth said with studied casualness, I don't suppose you have any sense yet, any early impression, of what might have occurred. Poirot paused at the door and turned, and his expression was entirely pleasant and entirely uninformative. My impressions at this stage, my lord, are like the little grey cells themselves. They require time and nourishment before they become useful. He smiled. Good night. He spoke briefly with Mr. Hargreave, who was precise and observant, and had noticed the hesitation before Sir Douglas drank, confirming Mrs. Vane's account, and who had also noticed, though he had not thought much of it at the time, that Lord Ashworth had glanced at Sir Douglas immediately after handing over the chalice. Not the glance of a host checking that his guest was comfortable, something more pointed than that. "Like a man watching for something," said Mr. Hargreave, with the careful phrasing of a solicitor who understands the weight of words. Poirot thanked him. He then spoke with the young French attaché, Beaumont, who was polite, precise, and revealed, with a delicacy that suggested he was revealing it intentionally, that Sir Douglas Pembridge had been a subject of some professional interest to the French embassy in recent months, in connection with the Near East negotiations. He did not elaborate, and Poirot did not press him on this point. Some threads, he knew, were best approached from a different angle. It was past 2 a.m. when Poirot finally sat alone in the small sitting room where he had first spoken with Crail. The fire had gone out entirely. The cup of tea, still tea, nobody had corrected the situation, sat cold and untouched on the table beside him. The house had quieted. Most of the guests had been permitted to give their addresses and depart. Crail was somewhere upstairs dealing with the practicalities. Poirot sat very still. His eyes were not quite closed, not quite open. That particular state of his, which looked from the outside like drowsiness and was in fact the precise opposite. His little grey cells, as he called them, were working, assembling, discarding, arranging. Mrs. Vane. Too still, too prepared, too careful. A woman with history she had not disclosed. Lord Ashworth, cooperative on the surface, controlled beneath, and that flicker of calculation when the wine bottle was mentioned. That glance at Sir Douglas, noted by Hargreave. A man watching for something, Sir Douglas himself hesitating before he drank. Deciding, Mrs. Vane had said. Not reluctance, deciding. The wine bottle, gone. An error that had cost them something, though Poirot was not yet certain how much. The chalice, which had been touched by Lord Ashworth's hands when he filled and passed it, and by Sir Douglas's hands when he drank, and by nobody else so far as anyone had observed. So far as anyone had observed. Poirot's eyes opened a fraction more. There was something, not a conclusion. He was careful not to call it a conclusion. But something that did not quite sit correctly, like a small stone inside a well-made shoe. Something about the sequence of the evening. Something about the timing. Something that several people had told him, in different words, without quite realizing what they had said. He could not find it yet. It was there. He was quite sure it was there. But it had not yet resolved itself into clarity. Yezos, he disliked this. He disliked it genuinely and without embarrassment. Poirot did not enjoy the sensation of not knowing. It was, he felt, an entirely reasonable thing to dislike. He straightened in his chair, smoothed his waistcoat and told himself, firmly as one tells a restless child, that the grey cells would find it. They always did. He picked up the cold tea, regarded it and set it down again. They had better, he thought, and soon. The clue. Poirot. Misses. The telephone call from St. George's Hospital came at 20 minutes past 8 the following morning. Poirot was awake. He was always awake by 7, a habit so deeply ingrained that even on the rare occasions he wished to sleep later, his body refused to cooperate. He was at his breakfast table in his dressing gown, with a cup of properly made tisane and a soft-boiled egg that was, he had already established, 30 seconds past the ideal. He was contemplating this small injustice when the telephone rang. It was Dr. Marsh. Sir Douglas Pembridge was alive. This was the first thing and the most important thing, and Poirot received it with a quiet exhalation that was more relief than he would have admitted to anyone. Sir Douglas was stable, conscious as of an hour ago, and, in the considered opinion of the hospital physicians, likely to recover. The recovery would be slow, and the next 48 hours remained critical. The poison, Dr. Marsh confirmed, had been identified. It was aconitine. Derived from the monkshood plant, aconite, known also as wolfsbane, colourless, nearly tasteless, extraordinarily dangerous in even small quantities, and crucially, not the sort of thing one acquired by accident or ignorance. It required knowledge. It required access. It required, above all, intent. Poirot thanked Dr. Marsh, replaced the receiver and returned to his egg. He ate it in silence, thinking. Crail arrived at Whitehaven Mansions at 9:30, looking as though he had not slept, which he had not. He accepted the cup of tea, Mrs. Turner produced with visible gratitude and sat across from Poirot at the breakfast table with his notebook open and his long face arranged in the expression of a man with several problems and insufficient solutions. "Aconitine," he said. "Yes," said Poirot. "Found in the chalice residue, the laboratory confirmed it an hour ago." Crail turned a page. "It's a curious choice, not easy to obtain, not the sort of thing you find in a kitchen cabinet." "No," agreed Poirot. "It is the choice of someone who knows what they are doing. Someone with either scientific knowledge or very particular connections." He paused. "Or both." "Which narrows things somewhat." "It narrows certain things," said Poirot carefully. "It opens others." He was quiet for a moment. "The bottle, Crail. The wine bottle. Have you located it?" Crail's expression indicated that this was not a question he had enjoyed pursuing. "We have. It was washed. Last night. By the kitchen staff. In the ordinary course of clearing. There is nothing left to examine." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "And the kitchen staff, the full complement of them, who was in the dining room or had access to the sideboard yesterday? We've spoken to all of them. The butler, a man named Crosby, been with the Ashworths 11 years, brought the bottle up from the cellar at 3 in the afternoon and placed it on the sideboard in the dining room to breathe. From 3 o'clock until the guests sat down at 8, the dining room was, in theory, accessible to anyone in the house." "In theory," repeated Poirot. "In practice, Crosby says he was in and out throughout the afternoon. Lady Evelyn came in at around 5 to check the table setting. Lord Ashworth looked in briefly before dressing for dinner, and," Crail checked his notes, "Mrs. Cecily Vane arrived early. At 6:30, approximately 30 minutes before the other guests. She was shown to the drawing room, but Crosby admits there was a period of perhaps 10 to 15 minutes during which he was occupied in the kitchen, and she was, technically, unattended on the ground floor." Poirot looked at him. "I know," said Crail before Poirot could speak. "It was this, the fact of Mrs. Vane's early arrival and those unattended minutes, that occupied the centre of Poirot's attention for most of that morning, and it was this he would later acknowledge with the particular honesty he applied to his own errors that caused him to miss something. Not miss it entirely. The information was there. It had been given to him, in plain enough terms, during the interviews the previous night. But in the manner of a man who has found a thread that appears to lead somewhere, he followed it, and in following it, did not look with sufficient care at the other threads lying beside it. He focused on Mrs. Cecily Vane. There was, he told himself, good reason for this. She had arrived early. She had been unattended near the dining room. She had known Sir Douglas. Cordially, she said, though the word had carried that slight weight of the carefully chosen. She had been watching all evening with the composed attentiveness of someone who was waiting for something to happen, or ensuring that it happened correctly. She had been the first to say the chalice should not be touched. That last point, Poirot turned it over more than once. Why would she say that? Two possibilities presented themselves. The first was innocent. She was an intelligent woman who recognized quickly that something was wrong and acted sensibly. The second was less innocent. She said it because she knew why the chalice mattered, and ensuring it was preserved, rather than cleaned away like the wine bottle, served some purpose of her own. He was, he would later concede, somewhat too interested in the second possibility. He sent a message through Crail requesting a fuller background inquiry into Mrs. Vane, her late husband, her finances, her connection to the diplomatic world. He spent a portion of the morning constructing in his mind a careful and not implausible architecture of motive and means that placed her at the centre of the affair. It was a good architecture. It was internally consistent. It accounted for the observable facts with reasonable elegance. It was also, in one critical respect, wrong. Or rather, not wrong precisely, but incomplete in a way that amounted to the same thing. The thing he missed was this. During his conversation with Lord Ashworth the previous night, Ashworth had mentioned, in passing, with the ease of a man mentioning something he considers entirely unremarkable, that the particular bottle of Burgundy used for the chalice had been selected from the cellar that afternoon, that he selected it personally for special occasions. Poirot had noted this. What he had not noted, what he had heard without quite hearing, in the way that even the most attentive minds occasionally fail to arrest a passing detail, was the precise phrasing Ashworth had used. He had said, "I select it personally." And then, a moment later, when asked about access to the bottle, it would have been in the kitchen or the dining room sideboard. Kitchen or sideboard. 2 locations, not one. Poirot had fixed upon the sideboard, upon the dining room, upon the period of access from 3 o'clock onward, because that was where the bottle had ultimately rested before dinner. He had not returned with sufficient attention to the earlier part of its journey. The kitchen, the period before 3 o'clock, before the bottle reached the sideboard at all, the period during which the dining room was not yet relevant, and during which a quite different set of people had access. He would find it, but not yet. Not this morning. This morning he was following Mrs. Vane. Crail arrived again at 2 in the afternoon with the results of the background inquiry, and Poirot listened with the focused attention of a man expecting confirmation. What he received was more complicated. Mrs. Cecily Vane, née Hartley, had been widowed 4 years ago. Her husband, one Colonel Edmund Vane, had died of a cardiac episode while posted in Cairo. The death had been natural, unremarkable, and thoroughly investigated at the time. There was nothing there. She had no significant financial difficulties. She had a small but comfortable income from her husband's estate and a flat in Kensington. Her connection to Sir Douglas Pembridge was, as she had said, social and occasional. There was, however, one additional detail that the inquiry had surfaced. Some 3 years prior, Sir Douglas had been involved, peripherally apparently, but involved, in a matter concerning certain Foreign Office documents and their rather irregular passage to a party that should not have had access to them. The matter had been investigated quietly and had not resulted in any formal proceedings. 2 individuals had been identified as having knowledge of the documents. One of them was Sir Douglas. The other, the inquiry had found after some persistence, was a Colonel Edmund Vane, Cecily Vane's late husband. Poirot sat very still when Crail told him this. "So she had reason," said Crail. "She had reason," agreed Poirot. "The question is whether reason and opportunity are in this case sufficient, and whether—" He stopped. Something shifted. Not the detail about Colonel Vane. That was significant, certainly, but something else. Something that the detail had nudged sideways in his mind, like a hand moving a curtain, revealing just a corner of what lay beyond it. Kitchen or sideboard? He sat forward slightly. "Crail," he said. "The butler, Crosby. When he brought the bottle up from the cellar, at 3 o'clock you said, did he bring it directly to the sideboard in the dining room?" Crail looked at his notes. He said, he paused, read more carefully. He said he placed it to breathe. He didn't say specifically. "Telephone him," said Poirot. "Now. Ask him exactly where the bottle was between 3 o'clock and the time he carried it to the dining room sideboard." "Exactly, Crail. Every location. Every minute he can account for." Crail looked at him with the expression of a man who recognizes a shift in the wind without yet knowing what it means. He reached for the telephone. Poirot sat back, pressed his fingertips together, and waited, with the focused stillness of a man standing at the edge of something, not yet sure of the shape of what lies below, but beginning at last to see it. False accusation and realization. Crosby answered the telephone on the 3rd ring. He was, as butlers of his particular generation and training tended to be, precise in his recollections. Not because he had anticipated being asked, he had not, but because precision was simply the manner in which he had organized his professional life for the past 4 decades, and old habits of that quality do not loosen under pressure. They hold, if anything, more firmly. He answered Crail's questions with the measured, unhurried clarity of a man recounting something that had happened exactly as he described it, because it had. The bottle, he said, had been brought up from the cellar at 3 o'clock. He had carried it upstairs himself. He had not taken it directly to the dining room. He had taken it first to the butler's pantry, a small room adjacent to the kitchen, where he customarily dealt with wine before service, and had placed it on the narrow shelf there to begin breathing. It had remained in the butler's pantry until approximately 7:30, when he had carried it through to the dining room sideboard in preparation for dinner. Crail asked him whether the butler's pantry had been left unattended during that period. There was a brief pause. "Yes," said Crosby. "It had, several times." His duties in the afternoon had taken him throughout the house, and the pantry was not a room that required constant attendance. It was, however, a room that was accessible, from the kitchen corridor, by anyone in the domestic part of the house. Crail asked who had been in the kitchen corridor during the afternoon. Another pause, longer this time. The kitchen staff, naturally, Mrs. Jennings the cook, the 2 housemaids, the footman, Thomas, and... Here Crosby's tone carried the faintest quality of a man choosing his words with care. Lord Ashworth had passed through the kitchen corridor at some point in the middle of the afternoon. "He sometimes did," said Crosby, "when he wished to go to the garden without going through the main house." The corridor connected to the rear door. Crail wrote this down. He thanked Crosby and replaced the receiver. Then he turned to Poirot. Poirot had not moved. He was still in his chair, his fingertips still pressed together, his eyes still carrying that particular quality of interior focus that meant the grey cells were working at full capacity and were not to be interrupted. When Crail relayed what Crosby had said, Poirot listened without expression. When Crail finished, there was a silence of perhaps 15 seconds. Then Poirot said, very quietly, "The pantry. Yes. Not the dining room sideboard. The pantry. From 3 o'clock until 7:30. He unclasped his hands and set them flat on his knees, and Lord Ashworth passed through that corridor. In the middle of the afternoon. Crosby couldn't be more precise than that." "No," said Poirot, "he could not." He was quiet again. Then, with the decisiveness of a man who has found the thread and intends to pull it, "I have been looking in the wrong place, Crail." Crail set down his notebook. "Mrs. Vane." "I allowed myself to be drawn by motive and by manner," said Poirot. He said it plainly, without drama, in the tone of a man conducting an honest audit of his own thinking. She had reason. And she had opportunity, or what appeared to be opportunity. She was composed when composure seemed wrong. These things accumulated, and I followed them. He paused. But the poison was in the chalice, or in the wine before it reached the chalice, and the bottle was in the pantry from 3 o'clock. Mrs. Vane did not arrive until 6:30. She was shown directly to the drawing room. Whatever access she may have had to the ground floor during those unattended minutes, the dining room sideboard was not where the opportunity lay. The pantry was, and she had no access to the pantry. Crail was quiet for a moment. Whereas Lord Ashworth had access to the pantry, lives in the house, knows its geography entirely, and, Poirot's eyes sharpened, selected that particular bottle personally. He told me so himself. See, he knew exactly which bottle it was. He knew where it would be. He knew the sequence of the evening down to the last detail because it was his evening, his house, his ritual. He rose from his chair. "I need to speak with Lady Evelyn," he said. "Not Lord Ashworth. Lady Evelyn, alone, and as soon as possible." They drove to Grosvenor Square in Crail's motor car through a London afternoon that had turned sullen and grey, the kind of afternoon that seems to have given up on the day entirely and is simply waiting for evening to arrive and relieve it. Poirot sat in the passenger seat and said nothing, which Crail had learned over the years to treat as a sign of significant internal activity rather than discomfort. Lady Evelyn received them in the drawing room. She was dressed, composed, and entirely correct in her manner. The manner of a woman who has been brought up to receive whatever the world produces with an outward equanimity that costs considerably more than it appears to. She was perhaps 55. Her face was handsome rather than pretty, and had about it the quality of a face that had once been easier to read and had learned over time to become less so. She offered tea. Poirot, somewhat to Crail's surprise, accepted. When the tea had been brought and the housemaid had withdrawn, and the three of them were alone in the drawing room with the grey afternoon pressing against the windows, Poirot set down his cup and looked at Lady Evelyn with an expression that was, in its way, kind. Genuinely kind, not the professional kindness of a man managing a witness, but something more personal. "Lady Ashworth," he said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that your answer will be held in the greatest confidence by myself, and that I ask it not to cause you pain, but because I believe you already know a great deal more about this matter than you have yet said." She looked at him. Her hands, folded in her lap, did not move. "Ask it," she said. "Your husband," said Poirot. "In the weeks before this dinner, his state of mind, his behaviour, was there anything that concerned you?" A long pause. Outside, a motor car passed along the square. "Yes," she said, quietly, just the one word. "Will you tell me?" Another pause. Longer. She looked at the window, then back at Poirot, with the expression of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for some time and has just been offered, for the first time, the possibility of setting it down. "Gerald has been, not himself," she said carefully, "for several months. There is a matter, a professional matter, I believe, though he has never explained it to me fully, connected to his time at the Foreign Office. I know only that it involves Sir Douglas, that there is something between them, something unresolved." She paused. "He received a letter about 3 weeks ago. He read it in his study, and I saw his face when he came out. I have been married to Gerald for 28 years, Monsieur Poirot. I know his face." "What did his face tell you?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "That he was afraid," she said, and that he had decided something. The room was very quiet. "The dinner," said Poirot gently. "Whose idea was it to invite Sir Douglas?" Lady Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "Gerald's," she said. "It was entirely Gerald's." They left Ashworth House 40 minutes later with a great deal more than they had arrived with. On the pavement outside, Crail stood with his coat collar turned up against the cold and his hands in his pockets and said, "Ashworth." "Ashworth," agreed Poirot. "The motive being, what exactly? The Foreign Office matter?" "The Foreign Office matter," said Poirot, "is, I believe, the letter. Sir Douglas, who has a gift, you will recall, for reading rooms and understanding what people truly want, had acquired knowledge of something in Ashworth's past, something from his time as junior minister, something that, if it became known, would be considerably damaging." He paused. "The Near East negotiations are coming. Sir Douglas is the appointed envoy. He is, at this moment, a man of considerable influence and rising prominence. A man in that position, who holds that kind of knowledge about another man, that is leverage, Crail. Significant leverage." "Blackmail," said Crail flatly. "The word is yours, but the shape of it—" "Yes." Crail was quiet for a moment. So Ashworth decided to remove the problem. "He invited the problem to dinner," said Poirot. "He filled the chalice himself. He passed it to Sir Douglas himself, in front of 12 witnesses, in the most public and civilized of settings. Because if something went wrong, if it ever came to questions, he was simply the host performing a tradition he had performed many times before. And the perfect innocence of ritual." He looked up at the facade of Ashworth House, those carefully polished railings, that insistent brightness. "It is, in its way," he said, "a very elegant plan. If Sir Douglas had died, it might even have been perfect." "But he didn't die." "No," said Poirot, "he did not. He turned from the house. And now, mon ami, we must prove it." They were halfway back to the motor car when Poirot stopped. Crail turned. "What?" Poirot was standing very still on the pavement, his head slightly tilted, with the expression of a man who has just heard a word in a conversation he thought had ended. "The letter," he said. "What about it?" "Lady Evelyn said her husband received a letter 3 weeks ago, that he read it in his study." He turned to look at Crail. "We have been thinking of this as Ashworth acting to protect himself from Sir Douglas. But consider, if Sir Douglas held knowledge that threatened Ashworth, he would have used it long before now. Why wait? Why write a letter 3 weeks before a dinner, at which he then hesitates before drinking from the chalice?" He paused. "Unless the letter was not from Sir Douglas to Ashworth." Crail stared at him. "You mean—" "I mean," said Poirot slowly, "that perhaps it was the other way entirely. Perhaps it was Ashworth who had been applying pressure to Sir Douglas. Perhaps the Near East appointment, the timing of it, the prominence of it, represented a threat to Ashworth specifically. And the letter 3 weeks ago was not a threat received, but a warning delivered." He paused. "Or a refusal. Sir Douglas refusing to be managed any further." The grey afternoon settled around them. "That changes things," said Crail quietly. "It changes the direction," said Poirot, "not the destination." He walked on toward the motor car. "We need that letter, Crail. It will be in the study. Get a warrant tonight." The truth surfaces. The warrant was obtained by 9 o'clock that evening. Crail had moved with unusual speed. Unusual, at least, for a man of his temperament, which tended toward deliberateness rather than urgency. But there are moments in an investigation when a detective feels, in the bones rather than the mind, that time is becoming a factor, that the ground is shifting. That somewhere, in a well-appointed study in Grosvenor Square, a man who was clever and careful and had spent 30 years navigating the most dangerous rooms in Whitehall was beginning to understand that his position was no longer as secure as it had been 24 hours ago. Crail felt this, and so he moved quickly. Poirot accompanied him to Ashworth House for the second time that day. It was past 9 in the evening when they arrived, and the square was dark and quiet, the Georgian facades reduced to pale suggestions behind the lamplight. Lord Ashworth received them in the entrance hall with a composure that was, Poirot thought, genuinely impressive. The composure of a man who had prepared himself for this possibility and had decided in advance exactly how he would conduct himself when it arrived. He looked at the warrant. He looked at Crail. He looked last of all at Poirot. "I see," he said. Nothing more. He led them to the study himself. The study was a room that reflected its occupant with perhaps more honesty than Lord Ashworth would have wished. It was ordered to the point of severity. Every paper squared, every book aligned, the surface of the desk entirely clear except for a leather blotter and a single pen set in its holder. It was the room of a man who valued control above almost everything, who found disorder not merely inconvenient but threatening, who arranged the visible world around him as a form of reassurance that the invisible world could also be managed. On the wall behind the desk hung 3 framed photographs, a younger Ashworth shaking hands with a man Poirot recognised as a former Foreign Secretary, Ashworth at some official function, uniformed figures around him, and a third, smaller, slightly apart from the other 2, a photograph of a group of men outside what appeared to be a government building, taken perhaps 15 or 20 years ago. Poirot looked at this third photograph for a moment before turning his attention to the room. Creil's constable, Willis, who had clearly resolved to redeem himself after the wine bottle disaster, began a systematic search of the desk drawers with careful, methodical hands. Poirot moved slowly around the room's perimeter, not searching exactly but looking. There is a difference, he had always maintained, between searching and looking. Searching is the act of a man who knows what he wants and pursues it directly. Looking is the act of a man who wants to understand what is there. Lord Ashworth stood near the door, his hands clasped behind his back, watching all of this with an expression of controlled neutrality. Lady Evelyn did not appear. The letter was not in the desk. Willis worked through every drawer with painstaking thoroughness and found nothing of significance. Correspondence relating to estate matters, some older papers from Ashworth's Foreign Office, years that Creil set aside for later examination, household accounts. But no letter, no personal correspondence of any kind that bore on the matter. Creil straightened and looked at Poirot. Poirot was standing in front of the bookshelf on the far wall. He was not looking at the books. He was looking at the small framed photograph he had noticed earlier. The group of men outside the government building. He had taken it from the wall and he was examining it with the focused attention he gave to things that interested him. "Poirot," said Creil, "the letter isn't here." "No," said Poirot without turning around. "It would not be in the desk. A man like Lord Ashworth does not keep dangerous correspondence in the obvious place." He paused. "He keeps it somewhere it cannot easily be found, but somewhere he can reach it quickly if he needs it." He set the photograph down on the desk and looked around the room once more. His gaze settled on the fireplace. It was a handsome fireplace, marble surround, iron grate, the remnants of a recent fire reduced to cold grey ash. Above the mantelpiece, a large mirror in a gilt frame. To the left of the fireplace, a small alcove containing a single upholstered chair and a low table with a reading lamp. On the table, a book, left open, face down, in the manner of a man interrupted while reading. Poirot crossed to the table and looked at the book without touching it. It was a history of the Italian Renaissance, thick and serious and somewhat improbable as casual evening reading. He looked at the table itself, then he looked at the reading lamp. Then he crouched, with the slight effort of a man his age performing a movement his knees consider unnecessary, and looked at the underside of the low table. Taped to the underside in a plain white envelope was a folded document. He stood, retrieved it with careful fingers, and turned it over. The envelope was unsealed. He removed the contents, 2 sheets of paper, handwritten, and read them with the unhurried attention of a man who reads things properly rather than quickly. When he had finished, he read them again, then he handed them to Creil. The letter was from Sir Douglas Pembridge. It was dated 18 days ago, which placed it, Poirot noted, at approximately 3 weeks before the dinner, consistent with what Lady Evelyn had described. It was written in a precise, educated hand, the hand of a man who chose his words carefully even in private correspondence, and it was addressed to Lord Ashworth by his Christian name. Creil read it standing, his face still, only his eyes moving. When he finished, he turned to the first page and read it again as Poirot had done. The letter was not a threat. This was the first thing, and it was significant. It was, in its way, almost the opposite of a threat. It was a letter of refusal. Sir Douglas wrote that he had considered the matter, referred to only obliquely as the matter we discussed in October, and had decided that he could not, in good conscience, continue as Lord Ashworth had requested. He wrote that he understood the implications of this decision for Lord Ashworth, and that he regretted the difficulty it would cause. He wrote that he intended to proceed with his appointment to the Near East negotiations without the conditions Lord Ashworth had sought to attach to his silence. He wrote that he bore Ashworth no personal ill will. And then, in the final paragraph, in language that was careful but perfectly clear to anyone who read it with attention, he wrote that he had placed a full account of the matter. The original matter, Ashworth's matter, the thing that had passed between them since Ashworth's time as junior minister, with his solicitor, with instructions that it be opened and acted upon in the event of his death or serious incapacitation. Crail lowered the letter and looked at Lord Ashworth. Lord Ashworth had not moved from his position near the door. He was still standing with his hands clasped behind his back, and his face was composed, but composed now in the way of a man holding something together by force of will rather than ease. Sir Douglas, said Poirot quietly, was not threatening you, my lord. He was protecting himself. He was telling you, with some courage, I think, that he would not be managed, and that he had taken precautions. He paused. And so you invited him to dinner? Ashworth said nothing. The matter itself, said Crail. What is it? What is the original matter? It emerged in pieces over the following 2 hours, from the letter itself, from the older papers Crail had set aside from the desk, and eventually, in fragments, from Lord Ashworth himself, who said very little but whose silences in the end were as informative as speech. In the late 1940s, during Ashworth's final years as junior minister, there had been a series of negotiations relating to commercial interests in the Near East. Oil interests, principally, of the kind that did not bear close examination by those outside the relevant rooms. Certain decisions had been made, certain information had been made available to certain parties who had paid, not the government, but individuals within it, for the privilege. It was not, in the strict sense, espionage. It was rather the quieter, more English variety of corruption, the kind that wears a good suit and knows exactly which club to belong to, and which is considered in some circles barely corruption at all. Sir Douglas had been peripherally involved. He had known about it. He had not participated directly, or this appeared to be true, but he had known and had said nothing, and his silence had been, in its way, a form of complicity. When the matter had been investigated quietly some years later, Sir Douglas had been protected in part by Ashworth's assurances. They had been, since then, bound together by mutual knowledge. The difference between them was that Sir Douglas had come, in time, to find this binding intolerable. He was a man of genuine ability, genuinely ascending with a genuine appointment ahead of him that he wished to fulfill without the weight of Ashworth's hand on his shoulder. He had decided, 18 days before the dinner, to free himself. Ashworth had decided that Sir Douglas's freedom was something he could not afford. The aconitine, said Crail when they were alone in the study, Ashworth having been asked with formal politeness to remain in the house. Where did he get it? That, said Poirot, he will require some inquiry. He's a man with connections, scientific, political, international. It will not be impossible to trace, though it will take time. He paused. There is also the question of when it was introduced. We know the bottle was in the pantry from 3 o'clock. We know Ashworth passed through the kitchen corridor that afternoon. Whether the poison was introduced into the bottle or into the chalice directly, at some point during the dinner perhaps, when attention was elsewhere, this will need to be established. The chalice itself had traces, yes, but aconitine in the wine introduced to the bottle would also leave traces in the chalice after the wine had been poured. The two are not mutually exclusive. He sat down in the reading chair, the chair beside the low table where the letter had been hidden, and pressed his fingertips together. What we have, Crail, is this. We have a letter that establishes motive with considerable clarity. We have testimony from Lady Ashworth that her husband received that letter and was visibly disturbed by it. We have Ashworth's own access to the bottle throughout the afternoon. We have his singular knowledge of the ritual, the chalice, the wine, the sequence of the evening. We have the evidence of Mr. Hargreave, who saw him watching Sir Douglas in the moment after the chalice was passed. He paused. We have, I think, sufficient to proceed. It's not a confession, said Crail. No, agreed Poirot, it is not. We will need the solicitor's document, the account Sir Douglas placed with his solicitor. That will tell us the full shape of the original matter and will corroborate the motive. He looked at Crail. And we will need Sir Douglas himself when he is well enough to speak. He knows what he wrote in that letter. He knows what he knew, and he is alive, Crail, which means he can tell us. Crail was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the slightly reluctant quality of a man giving credit where he would prefer not to, "You got there." Poirot looked at him mildly. "Eventually," he said. It was not false modesty. It was accurate, and he preferred accuracy. It was past midnight when they left Ashworth House for the second time that day. A uniformed officer had been placed discreetly at the house. Not an arrest, not yet, but a presence. Lord Ashworth had made no further statement. He had sat in the drawing room with Lady Evelyn, who had appeared from somewhere in the upper house at some point in the proceedings, and the two of them had sat together with the particular silence of a marriage that has reached a place from which it does not know how to return. Poirot had not looked at Lady Evelyn when he left. He had wanted to, but he had not. Some things he had found were better left without the weight of a direct gaze. On the pavement outside, the night was cold and clear. The fog that had pressed on London all week had lifted, and there were improbably a handful of stars visible above the rooftops of Grosvenor Square. Poirot looked up at them briefly. "Tomorrow," said Crail. "Tomorrow," agreed Poirot. "We finish it." The Unmasking. Sir Douglas Pembridge was moved from the critical ward to a private room on the third floor of St George's Hospital on the morning of the third day. Poirot arrived at 10:30, alone. He had asked Crail not to come, not for the first conversation. Crail had objected in the manner of a man who objects because it is procedurally correct to object, and had then agreed in the manner of a man who recognises that some conversations are better conducted without the formal weight of Scotland Yard in the room. He would be available, he said. He would wait downstairs. Poirot thanked him, straightened his hat, and went up. The private room was small and south-facing, and the winter sun, thin and pale but present, came through the window and lay across the foot of the bed in a weak yellow stripe. Sir Douglas was propped against two pillows, his hands flat on the coverlet, his face still carrying the yellowish cast of a man whose body has recently been through something serious and has not yet fully forgiven him for it. He was thinner than he had been 3 days ago, if that was possible. His eyes, however, were clear. He watched Poirot come in and sit down in the chair beside the bed without speaking. He waited while Poirot removed his hat and set it on his knee and settled himself. And then he said in a voice that was quieter than his usual register but perfectly steady, "You are Poirot." "I am," said Poirot. "Crail mentioned you might come." A pause. "I am glad it is you rather than Crail. You know my work. I know of it. A man in my position makes it his business to know useful things." He looked at Poirot with the level, assessing gaze of a diplomat, a gaze trained to read what lay beneath the surface of a conversation. "You know, then?" "I know a great deal," said Poirot. "I have the letter." Sir Douglas closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly, but the faint relaxation of a man who has been bracing himself for a blow that has finally landed and found it, in the event, survivable. "Gerald," he said. "Yes." A silence. The thin sunlight moved slightly as a cloud passed outside. "I did not think he would actually do it," said Sir Douglas. He said it without bitterness, with something closer to sorrow, and something that was, Poirot thought, the honest reflection of a man examining his own misjudgment. "I thought the letter would be enough. That making clear I had taken precautions, that Carrington had the account, would be sufficient to persuade him that there was nothing to be gained by." He stopped. "I miscalculated." "You miscalculated the depth of his fear," said Poirot gently. "Yes." Sir Douglas looked at the window. "Gerald has always been afraid. It is the thing about him that most people do not see, because he presents so well, all that silver hair and steady voice and Foreign Office polish. But underneath it, fear, always fear. Fear of exposure, fear of diminishment, fear of being seen as less than he has arranged himself to appear." He paused. "I knew this about him. I should have understood what a frightened man will do when he believes he has no other option." "You gave him the option of letting you go," said Poirot. "I gave him the option of behaving decently," said Sir Douglas, with a slight edge that was, perhaps, the closest he came to bitterness. "It is not always the same thing." Poirot asked him, then, about the original matter. He asked it directly, because the moment seemed to call for directness, and because Sir Douglas was a man who would respond better to directness than to the careful approach. Sir Douglas told him. It confirmed, in its substance, what the letter and the older papers had suggested. The Neary's commercial dealings of the late 1940s, the money that had passed through hands it should not have passed through, the decisions made in rooms that had no official record of their meetings. Ashworth had been the principal, the one who had arranged the access, facilitated the exchange, benefited most directly. Sir Douglas had been, as he acknowledged without evasion, an informed bystander. He had known. He had said nothing. He had been young and ambitious, and had told himself that it was not his matter to pursue. He did not excuse this. He stated it plainly with the steady self-knowledge of a man who has had some years to examine his own role and has reached conclusions that do not entirely flatter him. I have thought about it a great deal, he said, particularly in the last year, as the appointment came closer. I decided that if I was to do this work, the Near East work, with any integrity at all, I could not do it while Ashworth still held that over me, while I still owed him my silence. He looked at Poirot steadily. I wrote to him. I told him I was going forward without conditions. And I told him about Carrington. The solicitor? Yes, Richard Carrington. He has the full account, written by me, signed, sealed, with instructions that it be opened if anything should happen to me. A faint dry pause. Something very nearly did. It will need to be opened regardless, said Poirot, in the proper way through the proper channels, for the proceedings against Lord Ashworth. Sir Douglas looked at him for a moment. Yes, he said, I know. He said it as a man says a thing he has already made peace with, even if the peace was hard won. I am implicated too, Poirot. I know that. Your role will be examined, said Poirot honestly. I will not tell you otherwise. But you are the victim of an attempt on your life, and you have, in the end, chosen transparency over convenience. Here, these things are not nothing. Sir Douglas said nothing for a moment. Then, will he confess, do you think? Poirot considered this seriously. I think, he said, that Lord Ashworth is a man who has spent his entire life arranging how he appears to the world. Confession is the one act that strips that arrangement entirely away. He paused. But the evidence is substantial. The letter, Lady Ashworth's account, the access to the bottle, Mr. Hargreaves' observation, and there is the matter of the aconitine itself, where it was obtained, by whom. Creil's people are pursuing this, and they will find it. Men who acquire unusual poisons through unusual channels leave traces, however careful they are. He met Sir Douglas's gaze. He will not confess willingly, but I think in the end, saw he will not need to. They arrested Lord Gerald Ashworth at Ashworth House at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Poirot was not present for the arrest. He had given Creil everything he needed, the letter, his notes from every interview, a written summary of the reasoning that connected each piece of evidence to the next, and he had returned to Whitehaven Mansions, where Mrs. Turner had, entirely without instruction, prepared a proper tisane and a plate of the correct biscuits, as though she had known he would need them. He sat in his armchair and drank the tisane and ate 2 biscuits, and stared at the middle distance for a considerable time. Creil telephoned at 3:30. Ashworth had said nothing at the arrest. He had stood in the entrance hall of his house, those carefully polished railings outside, that insistent brightness, and he had looked at the warrant and at the officers and at Creil, and he had said very quietly that he wished to telephone his solicitor. That was all. No protest, no indignation, no performance. Just the one request made in the voice of a man who has run out of performances and knows it. Lady Evelyn had not been present. She had been, the housemaid said, in the garden, standing in the winter garden, in her coat, in the cold, not doing anything in particular, just standing. Poirot listened to all of this and said very little. When Creil had finished, there was a brief silence on the line. The aconitine, said Poirot. Any progress? Some, said Creil. There is a man, a chemist, semi-retired, apparently known to have supplied certain things to certain people over the years. We have his name from a contact in the Home Office. We'll have him by tomorrow, I think. Good, said Poirot. Another brief silence. The thing about the pantry, said Creil, with the careful casualness of a man raising a point he has been considering for some time. The wine bottle, in the butler's pantry from 3 o'clock. Ashworth had access from the corridor. He paused. But we still don't know with certainty whether he introduced the aconitine into the bottle, or whether he found another moment, during dinner perhaps, when the chalice was on the table and attention was distributed, to introduce it directly. No, said Poirot. We do not know this yet with certainty. The chalice residue shows aconitine. The bottle, as you know, is gone. He was quiet for a moment. There is, however, one thing I have been thinking about. What? Sir Douglas hesitated before he drank. Mrs. Vane observed it. Mr. Hargreave confirmed it. I asked Sir Douglas himself about this, at the hospital. And? He said he hesitated because he was, at that moment, thinking about the letter, about whether he had been right to send it, whether he had miscalculated. Poirot paused. He was not afraid of the wine, Creil. He had no reason to suspect the wine specifically. He hesitated because he was thinking about Ashworth, and then he drank, because a man at a dinner table in Mayfair does not refuse the chalice on the basis of an unspecified unease. It would have been rude. A short silence. "He nearly died," said Crail, "because it would have been rude." "He nearly died," said Poirot, "because he was an Englishman at dinner." A pause. "It is, I think, the most English sentence I've ever been required to say." Crail made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was perhaps the nearest he came to one in professional circumstances. 3 weeks later, on a grey February morning that was considerably less dramatic than the events it concluded, Lord Gerald Ashworth was formally charged with the attempted murder of Sir Douglas Pembridge, with the related charges pertaining to the acquisition and administration of a controlled poison, and with a series of additional charges arising from the Foreign Office matter, charges that had been assembled with considerable thoroughness from Richard Carrington's sealed account, from the older papers found in the study at Grosvenor Square, and from the testimony of several individuals who had, for some years, known more than they had said. The case was reported in the Times on the inside pages, with the restraint that newspaper traditionally reserved for the fall of men of Ashworth's sort. The words chosen were precise and careful, and conveyed, between their lines, a quality of quiet English horror at the idea that a man of such apparent standing could have done such a thing. A horror that was, Poirot reflected, somewhat misplaced in its surprise. Men of apparent standing had always done such things. That was rather the point of apparent standing. He received a note from Mrs. Cecily Vane 10 days after the arrest. It was brief. It thanked him, without excessive elaboration, for the discretion he had shown regarding her own background, the matter of Colonel Vane and the documents, which had been noted and had not been pursued further. Having no direct bearing on the case against Ashworth, she wrote that she hoped he would not think too badly of Edmund, her late husband, who had been, in his way, a decent man who had found himself in a situation he lacked the courage to leave. She did not ask for a reply. Poirot wrote one anyway. It was short. It said that in his experience, decent men found themselves in difficult situations with some frequency, and that the measure of a man was not whether he had ever been weak, but whether he had, in the end, tried to be better. He said he thought, from what little he knew, that Sir Douglas Pembridge had tried. He was not entirely sure it would comfort her, but he thought it was true, and in his experience true things had a value that comfortable ones did not always possess. He sealed the letter, gave it to Mrs. Turner to post, and sat for a moment in his armchair in the winter afternoon light. The golden chalice, he reflected, was presumably still in the possession of Scotland Yard as evidence. He found himself wondering, idly, what would become of it, whether it would eventually be returned to Ashworth House, which would now belong to Lady Evelyn alone, or whether it would simply remain in some evidence room, catalogued and labelled and no longer beautiful. It was, he supposed, a rather good metaphor for something. He was not entirely sure what. He reached for his tisane, found it had gone cold while he was thinking, and rang for Mrs. Turner to make a fresh one. Outside, London continued. The winter afternoon darkened toward evening. Somewhere across the city, in a private room at St. George's Hospital, Sir Douglas Pembridge was, by all accounts, getting slowly better. It was, Hercule Poirot decided, enough.